Okay, so welcome. My name's Ellen Burgess, and inspired by the previous session that was brilliantly delivered by Emily and Elizabeth, I've gone with a Bitmoji. Now, I'll admit that that's partly because I was completely inspired by the session, which I really was, but also lockdown makes your hair grow. So my pictures are all a little bit outdated at the moment and have me with short hair. So I thought this is a great time to rebrand myself and promote the wonderful session that Elizabeth and Emily just delivered. I work at Bilsey Primary School. I'm a lead practitioner there, and I also work for the Elliot Foundation as a regional innovations lead. And I'm really excited to be delivering this session today on digital pedagogy. So we'll make a start. What we're going to be covering in this session today is what is digital pedagogy, and I've very deliberately just crossed out the digital there because we're going to be looking at a deep dive into what pedagogy is by definition. We're going to be looking at some effective strands of digital pedagogy, how that might look in an effective learning sequence, and there will be a little bit of crossover there from Nick's great session this morning, so that will just be a skim through that, and we'll be able to send you the follow-up from Nick's session afterwards, and then just looking at the role of the digital adult as well. So first off then, what is digital pedagogy? And I found this quotation, which I'm going to give you a moment to read, which really summarizes the definition of pedagogy for me. It can be very difficult to define the word pedagogy. Every single person you ask will give you a different definition of it. Every single practitioner that you speak to will have different priorities when they come to define pedagogy. But I think the way that this quotation has summarized it as being the heart of teaching really jumped out at me as something that we can move forward with. And if we keep that in our mind, that pedagogy is around the heart of teaching, it's not a single element of it, then that helps us in developing our practice. So the first thing I'm going to ask is for you, and I've just talked about how we all have very different interpretations and understandings of what pedagogy is. What is it for you that are the key rules or principles of effective pedagogy? And of those, which are most important to you as a practitioner? And I'm going to ask that we're going to do this as a waterfall activity, which just really simply means don't press send yet. I'm going to give everybody just 30 seconds to write their response into the chat, and then we're all going to press send at the same time now and give us all a moment to just scroll back up and have a look at all of our different responses to that. So we'll just start that time now. So if we just have around 30 seconds to respond, what are the key rules or principles of effective pedagogy? Okay, 3, 2, 1, and press send. Great, thank you. Okay, we'll just take a minute to have a little read through those. There are some that straight away, as they were pinging up, were jumping out to me as being there's a lot of repetition in what we're all saying, which makes a lot of sense. Scaffolding, modelling small steps of learning, finding out what the children need and responding to that in an engaging way. That's a really great definition there. Intention, instruction, we've got modelling again, clarity. I do, we do, you do. Yeah, that's a great principle for effective pedagogy because that just encompasses so many of the core strands of a lesson. I do it, I'm going to model it to you. We do it, we're going to collaborate on it. You do it, you're going to practice it. And I think, you know, just by summarizing it in those 3 statements, help us to apply that to so many of our lessons. I'm really glad that somebody's put about relationships. Thank you for putting that, because sometimes when we think about pedagogy, we think about, oh, you've got to model, you've got to activate prior thinking, you've got to give them feedback, you've got to review, you've got to assess. Relationships sit at the heart of effective pedagogy. So it's really lovely that somebody's put that in there because it's what makes the whole of the school come to life and the learning experience for children come to life. We've got about building prior learning experiences, shared conversations, scaffolding, lots of modelling, 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 modelling. Yeah, I think if we were going to say what is most important to you as a practitioner, modelling's got to come up there, hasn't it? So that's really great. Thank you for that. Okay, so just to move on to the next part, in terms of defining pedagogy, as I'd mentioned, it is difficult to find a definition, and trust me, I have tried. I would have loved to be able to come to this session today and say, boom, this is pedagogy, do this. But we can't do that because every single child we teach is different. Every community that we work within is different. And us as practitioners, we are all different as well, and what works for one person won't work for a different person, and that's what makes our schools and our culture all so incredible. There are some guiding frameworks though that can support us in developing our practice so that it is inclusive of the really important part of key pedagogy. So Nick mentioned it earlier, and I'm just mentioning it again now. The Early Career Framework is such a wonderful resource. It takes the teacher standards, which is about setting high expectations, promoting good progress, having good subject knowledge, but it adds a lot more to it than that. It talks about adaptive teaching and what that might look like in the classroom and what types of activities a teacher would do that demonstrate that they are adapting the teaching to suit their learners' needs. And you can see that included in this is about managing behaviour. And that's part of what was just mentioned in the chat when we talk about relationships. Behaviour is a really important part of the pedagogy of a school and how that's managed to support our learners in having positive learning behaviours. And our own professional behaviours as well, and how we seek to develop ourselves as practitioners so that we can always be providing the best learning opportunities for our children. So this is the first document which I wanted to reference. And the second one was a document that I found from the National College for School Leadership. And there were a couple of slightly different phrases in this that jumped out to me. And I'm just going to give you a minute to have a look at those. So I've just highlighted in red the bits that really popped at me. The pupil voice, you know, when we are designing curriculum, when we are thinking about next steps, if we aren't involving our key stakeholders, the most important stakeholders, our pupils, in some of those processes, then we can't be clear that the pedagogy and that the learning experience they're going to get is right for them and it's what they want out of it as well. And then I love the fact that it's talking about it's not just what the teachers do, but it's also what the teachers know. And then it's why the teachers act the way that they do. And it's that layer of how we as practitioners help our children in their learning experiences. It talks about building on prior learning and experience, scaffolding a range of techniques. It also mentions in there metacognition, and metacognition is something that Nick mentioned earlier. It's something that I'm mentioning now. It is such a complex term that we're not going to go into a lot of detail on it now because it's a completely separate session to look at metacognition, particularly how we can support metacognition in a remote environment. But there have been lots of other webinars and there's lots out there if you want to learn more about metacognition. Assessment for learning is also in there and inclusive, and that's where it's kind of pinning back to the range of techniques and the scaffolding to ensure that every child is getting the curriculum that they need that's tailored to them. And here's another quote, and it's a bit of a funny story behind this quote because a colleague of mine who's on the call now, Rune, kept throwing around this term. Oh, well, you know, Ellen, it's the unconscious competencies. And I'd be like, yeah, the unconscious competencies, not really understood what he meant. And he said it a couple of times until I sort of plucked up the courage to say, sorry, Rune, what do you mean the unconscious competencies? What is that phrase? Because it sounds really good when you say it, and I'd quite like to say it, but I'm not sure whether I know what it means. And he was like, you know, you're unconsciously competent. It's the teacher that walks around the classroom, that taps the shoulder of the child that's looking at the sky, that, you know, uses their hands to engage, that asks a certain pupil a question, just as they were starting to watch the caretaker unload the bins in the car park. And that type of competency that educators get as they become more and more experienced and they become more aware of effective pedagogy. And I thought, has Rune made this up, or is there some sort of research behind this that I could find? And I found this hierarchy of competence, and it talks about how at the lower level it's the unconscious incompetence, so you don't even know what you're not doing right, and then it goes right up to the peak of the unconscious competence. It's about intuition. And I think that actually effective pedagogy is ingrained into the practice of the unconsciously competent educator. And sometimes we don't even know what it is that we're doing as educators that is ensuring that our pupils are learning and that effective pedagogy is running throughout it. So just to, bring that quote to you, and you can now hopefully use it yourselves and think about, what am I doing here as an educator, which is demonstrating that I'm unconsciously competent, because I'm sure many of you do lots of things all the time that are linked to that. Okay, so we've talked just briefly there about pedagogy and the definition of it and the frameworks that we can use to ensure that we are always thinking about pedagogy and developing it as educators. But just to come clearly now to digital pedagogy. Just putting a quote here for you to have a little read through, which just defines digital pedagogy. And that definition is that it's no different. Digital pedagogy is no different to pedagogy in the classroom. Our brains don't learn differently using remote education. Everything we know about effective pedagogy remains consistent in a remote platform as it does in the practical classroom. The same paradigm remains. Teachers want to impart knowledge so that our children can learn and they can use that knowledge in new and different ways, and that they can explore bigger concepts. So the concept behind digital pedagogy is exactly everything that you know already about effective classroom practice. What's really important when we think about digital pedagogy and remote learning and digital learning is that we start from the question, what do I want pupils to learn? Rather than what activities can I give them to do? Jo Jora, who I'm not sure whether she's on this call or not, I noticed her on a few earlier, posted a blog on Google Communities. I think it was just yesterday or the day before. And so I opened it up because I do like reading the blogs that Jo shares. And this was the first sentence on there. It talks about this joke where there is a man that says he's taught his dog to speak French. And his friend goes, really? Let's hear him then. He said, I taught him. I didn't say he'd learned it. And I just love that, Jo. That was opening to the blog. The blog went on to talk about how we need to make the learning experience for our children exciting and have purpose. And what are they contributing towards globally? Not just in their work, in their book, in their school, but what is it that the children are doing that gives it purpose? And I think that this is another really great quote that just links back to the definition of pedagogy. Pedagogy isn't teaching, it's learning, and that's got to be at the heart of it. So thank you, Jo, for sharing that. I wanted to just add that in there because it really jumped out at me. Okay, so effective digital pedagogy. Currently, we are in a position where remote learning has monopolised the education that we're providing for our pupils. School closures, bubble closures, self-isolating pupils. We have had to devise new ways of teaching and supporting our children through learning because of the school closure. But technology is here to stay. That's 100% certain. We have got 4,000 Chromebooks now across the trust because of the DFE fee support, and also the head office support and local support in helping us to fund that. That's a lot of devices. Andy Kreppel, who is our programme director, was saying we've actually got a ratio now of one device to every pupil premium child, which is a really wonderful ratio if you look back at what we've been able to achieve over such a short amount of time. So we can't just say, well, you know, technology was great. It got us through remote learning and school closures. Thank you very much. Put the Chromebooks in the cupboard. They'll come out at computing lessons, because it's a tool and it's a resource. And Nick shared this earlier. It's thinking about what's next. And then it's thinking about what might come later. What's next is definitely thinking back to homework and home learning, extended curriculum opportunities. We're shortly all going to be thinking a lot about tuition and catch up, and what role might innovation and technology have in supporting some of those processes that happen in schools. But then thinking a little bit further down the line, hybrid teaching and our learning environments. I visited a school a year ago now who had got a hybrid model, and it was really important that it was a hybrid model. They weren't all using Chromebooks. They weren't all on paper. It was hybrid. It was adapting and it was complementing. And I'm going to show the Samir model in just a moment, just to re-emphasize that. So also watching a webinar that Joanne Clifton had shared from someone called Michael Fullen. And he talked about where we're at the moment, and he talked about two tracks. He called it dual tracks. At the moment, where we are globally is we have got an emergency response and we have got an innovation response, and they are two lanes. And we need to be thinking about, okay, we've got our emergency response in terms of how we can support our learners as a result of the impact of school closures. Many of that will be to do with safeguarding, getting the children back into school, getting the children learning again. And that is a really important lane that all of our schools will need to go on. But also there is another lane. There is the lane of innovation and possibility. And if we go back to teaching how we previously have taught, we're not only doing our learners a disservice, but we're also doing the investment of technology a disservice, and ourselves, because there are exciting opportunities for innovation now which can support our pupils' learning. And we need to embrace those and be brave with that. And this is part of what Michael Fullen does a lot of work around in terms of deep learning. He talks about the 6 C's, and I thought that these linked really nicely to some of the key parts of pedagogy that we've just touched on. He talks about collaboration, creativity, critical thinking. This is obviously from an American resource here. Character, that comes back to that point again about relationship building and communication. And then in his essence of deep learning, I was so excited when I saw this part here, leveraging digital. And it comes right next to pedagogical practices. And I think that's lovely to see that we're seeing globally now that there is a recognition that digital pedagogy and digital tools can complement the traditional learning methods that we've been doing with our children, some of which fail some of our learners. So it's important to remember that just because we have done it doesn't mean we always have to. Anyone that has worked with me knows that this is one of my favourite research models when it comes to the use of technology. It's called the Samir Model, and it talks about the different layers of use of technology and how they can support different levels of innovation. At the moment, the type of technology we've been using has been very much largely a substitution. The children are in school. They don't have the pencils and the books. They don't have the teacher. We are substituting that using technology. So the work that we would have done in the books, they're doing on a Google slide. The lesson that they would have watched in class with the teacher delivering it, they're watching as a video. So at the moment, we are substituting. Our technology is acting as a direct substitute, possibly with no functional change. Now, this isn't a model of innovation that is one that we would move forward with, because it's been done because of the cause and the purpose. It's been done because of school closure. But when you start to work up this model and you think about the next layer, augmentation, technology acts as a direct substitute, but with functional improvement. And we know that using a lot of the G Suite resources that we use, collaboration is a basic functional improvement If you had a piece of paper and you gave it to 30 children and you said, write down all of your ideas about a certain topic, it would be absolutely manic. You can't have 30 children with one piece of A4 paper. I mean, you could try with an A1 sheet of paper, but I can promise you from experience, it is equally as manic. Whereas now we have got the tools and the technology that means that we can give them that piece of paper digitally. We can have 30, we could have 60 children all collaborating in one space, sharing their ideas and responding to them. And there are ways that that can be more or less effective. You know, all of us have been there where we've tried to share a Jamboard and they've deleted each other's sticky notes and they've been moving them around and layering them on top of each other. And you think, wow, that was a mistake. Okay, next time we'll think about a different way to do that. But later on today, there's a session on Nearpod. And one of the tools of Nearpod is a collaboration board. And that type of functionality gives a teacher just a little bit more control. You have to approve each post that gets put up there. Children can't move around and delete one another's responses. And so we learn, and the technology grows with us as well. And we've seen very much from Google over the last few months that as they can see educators need these functions and this functionality and feature, they do improve and they do develop with us. And then you get to modification. That's where it's like, okay, we're not talking paper and pencils anymore. We're talking about significant redesign. And I just think Emily and Elizabeth's session earlier with the Bitmoji, that is a significant task redesign. I can't think about how I would as effectively and efficiently provide my learners with so many different activities and tools and child-led opportunities to access the curriculum that I want in a really safe way, because every single resource that you might put into one of those Bitmoji classrooms has been hand selected by you for them. And that is a real core principle of effective pedagogy. It's around that pitch and it's ensuring that it's really tailored to the children's needs. And then the top layer is the redefinition. Technology allowing for the creation of new tasks that are previously inconceivable. And the example I always give for that one are the VR headsets and how we can take our children to the moon and we can take our children under the sea, because we've got that technology now that means virtual reality, augmented reality. It's here, it's at our fingertips. As a trust, we've already started to make investment in that and will continue to do so as the technology develops. So this is something to think about now, going back to Michael Fullan and thinking about those dual tracks and thinking we've got our emergency response to this situation, but we've also got an opportunity for innovation. And 4,000 Chromebooks, thinking about how technology can be used to augment, modify, or even redefine the learning experiences for our children, I think is really exciting. So we're just going to pin back in now to remote learning, and I love this picture from Ramsay Spinning Infant, with this boy sitting at his desk. You know, as much as possible his parents and his family had really supported him in finding a very respectful and engaging learning environment for their child to learn. And only year one, you know, what a superstar. Remote education is defined as a broad term encompassing any learning that happens outside of the classroom, and it's when the teacher is not present. So when we talk about remote learning, we do include in that homework and extended curriculum opportunities that go outside of the classroom. And here is a definition around remote learning, and just coming back to the point about digital pedagogy. Pupils can learn through remote teaching, ensuring that the elements of effective teaching are present. And that was from the EEF. And we can see there that, you know, he has got his environment set up. He's ready to learn, isn't he? He's got a comfortable chair. He's got his table at the right height. He's got a suitable device that he's working on. And so it's our role now as educators to ensure that the quality of provision that he's getting and the content is really closely aligned to core pedagogy and effective pedagogy. So when we think about that, what are the key elements of effective teaching and learning that we can include in remote education? And are there any that are more challenging? And I'm going to do another waterfall activity here. So I'll give you a minute just to reread that, and then I'm going to ask you to type it in the chat, but don't press send yet, and then we'll do a little countdown. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and press send. Great, thank you very much for that. So I'll just give everyone a minute just to scroll back up through and just have a look at everybody's responses. Yeah, Sean, I think your one really stands out there. Effectively stepping into correct misconceptions is more challenging. That is really challenging. And it's a point that Nick led on a little bit with this checkpoint in the framework. How can we try to incorporate opportunities for that with a remote environment? Because if we can try and predict misconceptions in advance, then that's really useful for supporting our learners. Yeah, and again, we've got modelling, we've got scaffolding, checking the children's learning throughout the process and the children's input and ideas, coming back to the pupil voice point that was made. Okay, so pupils can learn through remote teaching. We've just had that quotation. But a really key part of that and thinking about digital pedagogy is that it includes clear explanations, scaffolding and feedback, and it's more important than ever before. I've started to just bring together. I talked at the very beginning, it's really hard to define pedagogy, and I looked for that definition. But everything that you've been saying in the chat is what we've started to collect together here. Effective pedagogy is about scaffolding, feedback, explanation, collaboration, interaction, pitch, assessment, it being inclusive, metacognition. And this one was one that I stumbled across while I was doing a bit of research into this. Organized. If we think about our physical classrooms and how we like to have all of our displays complete, and there's a really clear structure. They know where they're going to get their pencils from, their pens from, they know where the rulers are going to be kept, they know where the glue sticks are going to be kept. And just like Nick's framework supported, having it organized in your Google Classroom organized supports the children in accessing their learning, and that supports an effective digital pedagogy. Because if our Google Classrooms are organized by days or by topics and the children understand that, then they'll be able to get to the learning more quickly and access the learning more effectively. Last year, the EEF did a rapid evidence assessment on distance learning, and they very clearly found that teaching quality is more important than how the lessons are delivered. They made 5 key findings, and I'll just give you a minute to skim through those. Now, one of the more recent reports that have come through from both Ofsted and from the EEF make reference to 2 forms of digital learning, and they talk about it specifically with remote teaching and learning that we've been doing during school closures. And these are the 2 terms which I'm just going to define so that everybody's got a really clear understanding. When we talk about remote learning, we talk about synchronous and we talk about asynchronous. Synchronous is live. So this is where we are coming on just now and I'm delivering this completely live with you. There are opportunities for interaction. There's opportunities for me to address misconceptions. That would be a synchronous education model. An asynchronous education is the one that, as a trust, the Elliot Foundation, we have adopted more widely. We have been providing our pupils with asynchronous when the material is prepared by the teacher and accessed by the pupil at a later date. Some of our schools now have started to have a hybrid where they've started to do some video calls at the start of a day, which is a check-in opportunity. It's to just set up the children with their learning. It might be addressing misconceptions or successes from the previous day. And then children go on to access an asynchronous education. And there are strengths and weaknesses to both. And there's been some reports and findings for both of them. I think for me personally, thinking about digital pedagogy and all of the really important strands to it, access is a key part of pedagogy. And having an asynchronous education model, as we have across the trust, means that if a child has only got one device but has got 6 siblings, it means it doesn't matter if they miss that live input and they won't get a chance to catch up on it, because our pre-recorded video content means that they can rewatch that video or they can access that lesson whenever they want. And sadly, we have seen pupils doing their work at 7 p.m, 8 p.m, 9 p.m. And that might be to do with attitude to learning. It could be cultural, but it could be really simply because there isn't a computer free, because parents are working all day, siblings are on live calls all day. And our model has enabled access and complete ease of access as well, because that lesson is there for them throughout the day and for days to come in a lot of instances for them to be able to get to. So that's a definition of the 2 forms of remote learning. And just to be really clear, that asynchronous is the one that we've adopted as a trust, with that hybrid synchronous model as well. And here's what Ofsted and the EEF have said about it. Live lesson isn't the gold standard of remote education. Live lessons have advantages, but they're not always more effective than an asynchronous approach. The EEF have said that there is no clear difference between teaching in real time and the alternative of asynchronous. And if we think about pedagogy, then it's really obvious why. Because provided, whichever the offer is that you're doing, the core concepts of effective pedagogy are clearly defined and clearly present, then why would it make any difference whether we were doing it live one-to-one or whether we were doing it in an asynchronous model? There are limitations to both, but in terms of which is better and which is worse, you can't define it, provided that pedagogy is at the heart. Throughout the Ofsted documentation that they published at the beginning of this year, they talked about exactly what remote education was, but then there were just a couple of really clear steps. Ofsted talked about just keeping it simple, and that's how Nick's framework really complements the work that we're doing today in this session. We don't need to overcomplicate it. We need it to be as accessible for all of our pupils as possible. When we're adapting the curriculum, we need to make sure we're focusing on the basics. It might be, and I've spoken to a lot of educators, how similar has your curriculum been remotely as it has been in class? And they've said things like, oh, well, we were going to do shapes, 3D shapes actually in January, but we just felt that 3D shapes might not complement as well in a remote environment. So we've just decided to just push that back until when schools reopen, and then we will do that topic. That makes a lot of sense to me. If we can design our curriculum so that it complements the environment that we're working in, then why wouldn't we? We don't want to restrict the curriculum content that they're getting, but absolutely it's about making sensible adaptations. And if we come back to the early career framework, it talked about adaptive teaching. This is what we're having to do as educators. We are adapting our teaching to complement the environment and the platform that we're currently working in. Feedback is more important than ever, and that is why as a trust we've got platforms in place that make that slick. That is why Google Classroom is the platform we've chosen, because feedback is a core part of effective pedagogy. And without a platform like Google Classroom, we are unable to do that. And I've seen some really lovely examples. I think it was the KRC Federation, where you had set up some booths outside of the school, and you'd all got your PPE on, and you were doing the very best you could to give feedback to those paper pack pupils as well, who are accessing remote learning in a physical kind of content. And I think that's really key, because again, it's a core part of pedagogy, whether it be that they're receiving a paper pack as their remote learning, or whether it be in a digital platform, it has to be present in all of our learning experiences. And then just at the bottom, the medium matters a bit, but again, it's coming back to the quality of teaching is far more important. I'm just going to give you a minute to read what's on the screen now. This point ties in really nicely with some work that's been started recently at the school that I work at, which is looking at a concept-based curriculum. And to put it into an analogy, and I love the onion reference in this, we teach our children about the Battle of Hastings, and we teach them about some of the key historical points that are related to the Battle of Hastings. But as we start to peel that back and unpeel that onion, at the heart of it is the concept of war and peace. And that concept is then transferable to any battle that we look at, or any sort of future experience that might happen, which is related to the core concepts of war and peace. And so whilst we teach the children some simple concepts around the Battle of Hastings, actually peeling it back into what the deeper concepts are is a really important part of designing our curriculum and getting to the heart of the pedagogy that sits behind it. And that is equally as important when we're thinking about remote teaching and learning. We're not just giving them an activity to do because it keeps them busy and they can learn something about it. We're giving them activities to do that are completely ingrained and invested and linked to our curriculum and the core concepts of our curriculum that we need our children to come away with. Some people call it the big ideas. You know, it's like with addition and subtraction. We're not just teaching them to add and subtract. We're helping them to understand that values get greater and values get smaller, and all of the different concepts that link with that. Okay, so we're going to come on now to the learning framework, which I'm going to go through quickly because Nick's done a full session on it. But for those of you that missed it or wanted to have it as part of this, so one of the things that's really important is thinking about the sequence of a learning framework and what the important parts of that are. Now, having a look at what you've already told us in the chat here, I can see that we're already really clear on what the important elements for learning sequence are, because so many of you have already responded saying that it is modeling, it's about scaffolding, it's about feedback, it's about relationships. So I'm going to skip through and just show you the report that Nick and the team have designed the Elliott Foundation Learning Framework around. And it is using the EEF framework at the heart of it. And it's talking about the sequences in a learning experience for the children. It's about activating the prior knowledge, explaining the learning, giving children opportunity to practice and reflect and review. And the framework that Nick has sent us all and has shared with us all has also got examples of what that looks like in a remote and in an online platform. And we'll send this over again to you as part of this session, but it's a really useful document for thinking about how pedagogy and the lesson framework are so closely aligned. Now, there are different types of terms that are being used for what should be included from a pedagogical point of view in a learning sequence. So the EEF are referring to it as activate, explain, practice, reflect, review. Some work that I was doing with a school in East Anglia, we're using the Rosenshine matrix for what an effective learning sequence might look like. Here we can see Confederation School Trust are talking about explanations of new content, interaction, scaffolded practice, assessment, feedback. We can call these terms lots of different things, but all of them closely aligned to what we understand as being effective pedagogy. And I think this is a really important part to just kind of take away from that. Becky Francis, the CEO of the EEF, just put it really blunt. Pedagogy trumps format. So when we are thinking about our Bitmoji classrooms and we are thinking about our learning framework, yes, they look beautiful, and they do look beautiful. The Bitmoji classroom is so beautiful, and I'm very much a person that walks around the supermarket and buys the things that look nice, which my husband has a great issue with, because I'm like, but it was in brown cardboard packaging. It's a sales tactic. So whilst that is part of me, it's also about thinking, what is the pedagogy at the heart of it? So not just making something look beautiful, but ensuring that the learning experiences and opportunities that we're creating for the children are always closely aligned to our curriculum and what we want the children to learn. That quote, what do we want the children to learn, not what activities do we want them to do? It's not about the activity and keeping our children busy using technology. The final section that I'm going to come on to is around the role of the digital adult. And I've crossed out digital because it's about the role of an adult. The fact that we're digital at the moment doesn't make any difference. So I just wanted to ask another question. What do you think the role of an adult is in the context of digital and remote learning? And I think that's quite a challenging question. So I'm going to give you a little bit of time to think about that. What is our role at the moment? Okay, 3, 2, 1, and post it. Wow, if I counted the amount of times it said the word support. Yeah, it's coming out really strongly. Support, support, support. Oh, Alia, your one I'm going to touch on in just a minute. I really like that you've put that about facilitation, because I think, and Ines has put the same, I think that's really challenging, facilitating learning at the moment, particularly with a remote context. Yeah, respect, celebrate, support, encourage, give them feedback. What is good, and yeah, what could be better? Definitely. We need to have those high expectations. It's one of our teacher standards to have high expectations. Provide learning that is accessible. Yeah, excellent. Access and feedback. Great. Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about the role of an adult in the context of a digital and remote learning environment. And I came across this quote because I think some people are scared. You know, if we come back again to Michael Fullan's quote about there being a dual track and about the emergency response and about the innovation response, how many of us, how many schools around the world are going to be brave enough to think about a new type of learning? And how many aren't and are going to do themselves and their children a disservice by not thinking about how digital technologies can complement the curriculum, not replace. A teacher that can be replaced by a computer should be replaced by a computer. Because I know from the work that we do in schools, there's not a computer in the world that would be able to replace the fantastic teachers that we've got. And it also links into a book that I've been reading. It's actually an early years book, but it talks about the role of a teacher. It talks about the role of a teacher and it defines them as 7 selves. It talks about the plural practitioner. And it made me think about us as teachers and everything we're doing, and Rune's point about the unconscious competencies of a teacher. You know, we care for the children, we observe their progress, we communicate with them, we assess them, we create content for them, we critically reflect environments and learning opportunities for them. We do so much, but it's not just us now, because now more than ever, parents are part of the children's learning experiences. We are at an opportunity now where we can extend learning home. And actually, if we think about parent engagement, the more excited children are about their learning, the more you hear from the parents. Because I know as a parent, when my son comes home and he's talking about something exciting he's done today, I'm excited and I want to talk to him more about his learning because it's exciting. And that is a really important way of engaging our parents and incorporating them as part of the children's learning journey. And now there's a third one, because it's technology. And it's thinking we don't have defined roles here. Technology doesn't have to be just the thing that assesses, oh, let's use Google Forms because it's a really great way of assessing the children's knowledge. Let's not just have teachers be the creators. I think it's really important to think about where, as much as possible, we can get into this central section of the Venn diagram and we can have all of us doing all of the parts of a practitioner and facilitating all of those roles. I think it's really key, and that's where it could be really exciting. And with regards to facilitation in a remote learning environment, I think that's been our biggest challenge. I think that we've done a great job as schools at communicating and creating content and assessing the content. Parents have done the caring, but from a safeguarding point of view, we've done that too as schools. We've checked that our children are safe, and we've done great work around ensuring that with the food boxes and all of the rest of that work that's been done. But the facilitating, that's been really tricky because we've been reliant in a lot of instances on the parents being the facilitator. And when I've been using some of the amazing lesson materials that Adele and Innes from the Hillingdon have produced for computing, I was sort of doing a trial with a bubble that I'd got using some asynchronous teaching content in a live classroom. I was really interested to think about the pedagogy that sat behind it. What is it about those lesson resources that provide what the children need for an effective learning experience? And the lesson resources are amazing. And I'll share the link again to the curriculum folder when they're stored. Sometimes, though, they just need a little bit more. Sometimes they just need that teacher to say, just click here, go to the next slide, or you can play that back. And, I think about my teaching, and I don't know whether it's just losing pride in myself, but I'm becoming more and more animated because I'm thinking, if I can sing it, if I can say it, if I can act it out, I will do whatever I can to help you learn. And that's what we do. That is what the unconsciously competent educator does. We not just dual code by giving them pictures, we try code, we act it, we sing it, we do everything we can to help our children learn. And I think facilitating that learning experience is something that we have to keep at the heart of when we're producing lesson content. How are we supporting them in learning? How are we facilitating their learning? How are we modeling how we would learn? And that links in with the metacognition. And how can technology be the tool that supports that? So this is the final quote that I'm going to end on now. Because technology won't replace great teachers, but it could make education transformational. And I think coming back to that Samir model, where we can start to augment, modify, redefine learning experiences for our children that are pinned to effective pedagogy, I think that the opportunities are endless. So yeah, I'm going to end there, and I will give an opportunity for any questions. I'll of course send through the slides afterwards, and I'll finish up. Thank you all for watching. Ah, yes, the evaluation. That's in the chat for you. Thank you. Good job you put that in there. Thanks, Roon. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind filling out the evaluation form, that would be great. Thank you very much. Very keen to offer more sessions like this, so knowing what you might want will be really useful. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and